"You're nothing compared to her," the millionaire sneered. 3 years later, he saw the girl in her arms and his blood ran cold. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Family. May the Almighty surround every woman with unbreakable courage, quiet wisdom, and a peace that no storm can shake loose. May your hidden battles become bridges to new blessings, and may every tear you shed open the doors of destiny and healing. You are the warmth in cold nights, the strength behind gentle words, and the heart that keeps love alive even when the world grows harsh. May your journey be soft, your spirit fearless, and your soul always covered in divine protection. My precious family, don't fall silent tonight. Your presence is the heartbeat of this home. A like is a light of hope, a comment, a spark of unity. This is Mission 1000 likes. For every woman who keeps loving, keeps believing, keeps rising even when she's broken. If you carry love in your heart, like this video. If your spirit walks in faith, comment, "I'm with Mr. Peter." The penthouse overlooked a city that glittered with promises Mitchell Home no longer believed in. But tonight he stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling something close to contentment as Margot Robbie moved through their space preparing dinner. She had been quieter than usual all week, retreating into herself in ways that made him attribute her distance to stress from her new position at the gallery, completely unaware that she carried a secret heavy enough to crush her beneath its weight. 3 days earlier, Margot had sat in a sterile medical office, listening to a doctor use clinical terms to describe an aggressive illness requiring immediate intervention, treatments that would devastate her body over months of procedures, a prognosis that depended entirely on beginning the battle within weeks rather than months. She had walked out of that appointment, clutching papers in shaking hands, while the world continued moving around her with cruel indifference, and she made a decision that felt both impossibly brave and desperately foolish. She would tell Mitchell tonight, over the elaborate dinner she had spent the entire afternoon preparing, and she believed with every fiber of her being that the man she loved would stand beside her through the storm that was coming. Margot had rehearsed the words 100 times while chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, practicing different approaches to delivering news that would fundamentally change both their lives. She had arranged candles with trembling fingers and set out the vintage cufflinks she had found at an estate sale months ago, the ones engraved with initials that reminded her of the sepia-toned photographs Mitchell kept of his grandfather in the study. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled their apartment with warmth and promise, familiar aromas that usually made Mitchell smile when he walked through the door, and she had even opened the expensive bottle of wine he had been saving for what he always called a truly special occasion. This qualified in the worst possible way, she thought, as she poured the deep red liquid into crystal glasses that caught the candlelight. She imagined his initial shock at her revelation would give way quickly to determination, that he would reach across the table and take her hands and promise they would face this challenge together the way couples were supposed to face impossible things, that their love was strong enough to survive what lay ahead, even if survival meant enduring months of uncertainty and fear. The diagnosis papers sat folded in her purse near the door, waiting for the moment when she would need to show him the evidence that this was real rather than some terrible nightmare she could wake from. But before she could begin the conversation she had so carefully planned, before she could even ask him to sit down at the table she had set with such hope, Mitchell's phone illuminated with a message that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. The photograph showed his former fiancée Celestine at some glittering European gala, draped in diamonds that caught the light like captured stars, her pale hand resting possessively on the arm of a distinguished man whose face radiated the kind of wealth and power that needed no introduction. Margot watched Mitchell stare at that image with an expression she had never seen cross his features before, something between longing and regret, and a hunger she recognized from their early days together, except now it was directed at someone else entirely, at the life he had abandoned when he chose her instead. She asked if everything was all right, her voice barely audible over the sudden roaring in her ears that made the room feel like it was tilting sideways, and when Mitchell finally looked up from that photograph to meet her eyes, something fundamental had shifted in his gaze. What he saw, standing before him, disappointed him in ways he had been trying to ignore for months, pushing down doubts that surfaced during business dinners where she did not quite fit, or charity galas where she seemed diminished by the company. Margot stood there in the simple dress she had chosen carefully from her modest wardrobe, her natural beauty suddenly unable to compete with the calculated glamour radiating from that photograph. And Mitchell felt the full weight of a choice he had been second-guessing since the day he made it. The words that followed were surgical in their precision, each one deliberately selected to cut deeper than the last, and Margot felt herself physically shrinking with every comparison he drew between her ordinary existence and Celestine's extraordinary one. He told her that choosing her had been an experiment in stepping outside the world he was born into, an attempt to prove he was not defined by his family's expectations and society's narrow parameters, but that experiment had revealed only how much he sacrificed by settling for someone so thoroughly ordinary. He compared her education at a state university to Celestine's finishing schools in Switzerland, where daughters of influential families learned to navigate rooms that mattered, her family's modest middle-class background to Celestine's bloodline that appeared in history textbooks and society registries going back generations, her quiet presence that disappeared in crowds to Celestine's ability to command immediate attention in any gathering. The wine she had opened sat untouched between them, growing warmer by the minute, and Margot watched candlelight flicker across Mitchell's face as he catalogued systematically every way she fell short of the woman he should have married, the woman his parents had groomed him to choose before she had temporarily distracted him from his appropriate path. The dinner she had prepared with such care suddenly looked pathetic to her own eyes, a sad, desperate attempt to create intimacy with someone who found her fundamentally inadequate in ways she could never fix or change. Mitchell gestured dismissively at the elaborate table setting, his movement cruel in its casual contempt, and delivered the words that would echo through both their lives across all the years that followed, words that could never be taken back or softened or explained away. "You're nothing compared to her, and I was a fool to think playing at this life with you could ever be enough for someone like me." The vintage cufflinks she had saved for weeks to afford slipped from Margot's suddenly nerveless fingers, rolling across the expensive hardwood flooring to rest against his Italian leather shoes. And she understood with devastating absolute clarity that the man she had been prepared to fight for, to endure unimaginable suffering beside, did not believe she was worth fighting for, even during the easy, uncomplicated times. The medical papers stayed hidden in her purse because his cruelty had just answered a question she had not yet asked, had not even begun to articulate. If Mitchell Home found her so thoroughly inadequate during the simple times when her only apparent flaw was being insufficiently impressive for his world, then asking him to stand beside her through the brutal treatment ahead would only invite more rejection, more comparisons, more evidence that she did not measure up to whatever standard he held in his mind. She thought briefly about telling him anyway, about watching his face shift from contempt to guilt, about forcing him to confront what his words had just destroyed, but even in her devastation, she retained enough self-preservation to understand that his pity would be infinitely worse than his contempt, that watching him struggle to be kind out of obligation rather than genuine care would finish whatever destruction he had already begun. Margot left without speaking a single word, because there was nothing left to say when someone had just told you that your entire existence represented a disappointment they deeply regretted. She walked through their apartment one final time, her eyes catching on small things she had contributed to this space that would never truly be hers. The plant she had nursed back to health on the windowsill that faced afternoon sun, the throw blanket her grandmother had knitted draped over his expensive designer couch, the framed photograph of them at the beach last summer that now felt like evidence of a different life that belonged to different people. She took none of it with her, left it all behind like she was leaving behind every piece of herself that had tried to fit into his world. The elevator descent felt endless, as though she was falling through space rather than simply descending floors. And with each level, Margot felt the crushing weight of two separate devastations pressing down on her chest, until breathing became difficult. The illness that might kill her was somehow less terrifying in that moment than the knowledge that the person she loved most in the world had looked at her with clear eyes and seen absolutely nothing worth keeping, nothing worth choosing, nothing that could ever be enough. She emerged onto the street, where the city continued its indifferent rhythm, people rushing past focused on their own concerns, while Margot stood on the sidewalk, feeling like the world should have stopped turning when hers just ended. She made a decision that would define everything that followed, standing there under streetlights while traffic hummed and strangers brushed past without seeing her. She would face the coming battle completely alone, because fighting for survival while carrying the burden of Mitchell's contempt and rejection would destroy her faster than any illness ever could, would poison her recovery before it even began. Margot Robbie had just learned that sometimes the cruelest thing someone can do is show you exactly who they are when you need them to be someone different, someone better, someone capable of seeing your value without requiring tragedy to reveal it. Chapter 2. The wedding that sealed his fate. Mitchell Home married Celestine 6 months later in a ceremony that dominated society pages across multiple publications and confirmed his triumphant return to the world where he had always truly belonged, though the victory tasted like ash and copper, even as he celebrated what everyone assured him was the culmination of everything he should want. The wedding unfolded in a historic estate that had hosted generations of influential families, forming alliances through carefully arranged marriages, 400 guests bearing witness as Mitchell placed a platinum ring on Celestine's perfectly manicured finger and told himself this was vindication of every choice he had made. He had corrected his temporary lapse in judgment, chosen appropriately this time with his head rather than making the mistake of listening to his heart, and the woman standing beside him in a custom gown that cost more than most people earned in a year represented everything his parents had raised him to value above all else. Celestine smiled for the assembled cameras with practiced perfection that came from years of training, her pale skin luminous against silk and imported lace, and Mitchell felt a surge of satisfaction as he surveyed the assembled crowd of power and privilege, nodding their approval of this union. This was the wedding he should have had all along, he told himself, while sealing vows with a kiss that tasted of expensive champagne and careful calculation, and the brief detour with Margot Robbie now seemed like a fever dream he had finally awakened from with his judgment restored. His parents beamed with visible relief from their position in the front row, finally able to hold their heads high again after the embarrassment of his relationship with that nobody girlfriend, and his business partners nodded their satisfaction from premium seats, already planning how to leverage this merger of influential families. The reception continued for hours with elaborately choreographed toasts, praising the perfect match and dancing that would be analyzed in social columns for weeks to come. But the carefully maintained performance ended abruptly the moment Mitchell and Celestine were finally alone in the bridal suite that had been prepared for their wedding night. He had imagined this moment repeatedly during their whirlwind courtship, convinced himself that Celestine's passion would match the intensity of their reunion after years apart. But the woman who closed and locked the door behind them bore absolutely no resemblance to the radiant bride who had smiled so beautifully for their guests downstairs. Celestine began removing her elaborate jewelry with the efficient, practiced movements of someone completing a necessary but tedious task. And when Mitchell reached for her with hands that trembled slightly from champagne and anticipation, she laughed in a way that made his blood run cold in his veins. The sound held no warmth or affection or even basic kindness, only the cruel amusement of someone who had just won a complex game. The other player did not even realize they were losing until the final move revealed everything. She told him to sit down on the edge of the ornate bed because they needed to have a conversation that would clarify exactly what this marriage actually meant going forward. And Mitchell felt the first stirrings of genuine dread as he complied with her command. Celestine explained everything with the clinical detachment of an expensive lawyer, outlining non-negotiable contract terms to a client who had no leverage for bargaining, and each word she spoke dismantled another piece of the fantasy Mitchell had constructed around this reunion. She had never loved him, not during their first engagement years ago when their families had initially arranged the match, and certainly not during their recent whirlwind reunion she had orchestrated after seeing that pathetic photograph he posted with his nobody girlfriend. The European diplomat whose arm she held in the photograph Mitchell had seen months earlier was her actual long-time partner, a relationship that had continued completely uninterrupted through both of her engagements to Mitchell home. But here was where Celestine revealed an unexpected complexity Mitchell had been far too arrogant to perceive beneath her polished surface. She was not simply mercenary in some straightforward, calculating way, but also fundamentally trapped by the same rigid system that had shaped and constrained them both since birth. Her family's finances had deteriorated catastrophically over recent years through a combination of bad investments and changing economic realities, and she had no choice whatsoever but to secure this particular merger regardless of her personal feelings or desires. She resented Mitchell for being the key to her gilded cage, even as she had expertly manipulated him into it, and there was real bitterness in her voice when she admitted that she genuinely envied what he had so carelessly thrown away with that girl. She told him that watching him compare that sweet, genuine person to her own carefully constructed persona had been almost insultingly easy, that she had known exactly which insecurities to exploit about belonging and status to make him destroy something real with his own hands. There was something almost like regret flickering behind her cold eyes when she said that at least he had been temporarily given the chance to choose authentic love over empty obligation before she dragged him back into line, a choice she herself had never been offered by anyone. Celestine informed him that she expected complete freedom to maintain her relationship with the diplomat, while Mitchell played the devoted husband in public settings, and that this particular arrangement was precisely how people of their class had always managed marriages when genuine affection was absent. She would attend all necessary social functions, smile perfectly for cameras and gossip columnists, and maintain the flawless appearance of wedded bliss for as long as the merger required. But her private life and her actual heart would remain entirely her own territory. Mitchell tried desperately to process what he was hearing, his champagne-fogged mind rejecting the reality even as Celestine continued systematically dismantling every assumption he had made about their future together. He protested weakly that surely they could build something real over time, that the undeniable chemistry between them during their courtship suggested genuine possibility for connection, and Celestine's expression shifted to something that might have been the first genuine emotion he had seen from her all night. She told him with unexpected gentleness that the chemistry was just another performance she had perfected over years of practice, that she was exhausted from performing every single day of her life, and he should be too, after spending months pretending they could somehow recapture something they never actually possessed in the first place. Her next words were delivered with a softness that made them cut even deeper. If he truly wanted genuine love and authentic partnership, he should have fought harder to stay with the girl who actually cared about him as a person rather than as a useful stepping stone, because Celestine would certainly never care about him in any meaningful way. Mitchell sat alone in that bridal suite for hours after Celestine had closed the bedroom door and disappeared into her own separate space. And for the first time since comparing Margot to the woman he had just legally bound himself to, he allowed himself to feel the full, crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake. The sounds of continued celebration drifted up from the reception that was still going strong below. Expensive champagne flowing like water while he sat on the edge of a bed he would not share with his new wife. And Mitchell understood that everyone downstairs believed they had witnessed a perfect union, while he had just learned he had deliberately imprisoned himself in a performance that would last until one of them died or could no longer maintain the exhausting facade. His first desperate instinct was to call Margot and beg her forgiveness, to somehow explain that he had been a coward and a fool, that her quiet authenticity was worth infinitely more than all of Celestine's calculated glamour and society connections. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and discovered her number was disconnected, and that small rejection felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of his own making. Mitchell Home had achieved everything he thought he wanted, married the woman everyone agreed was his perfect match, and that achievement felt like slowly suffocating in a room with no windows. Chapter 3. The Battle She Fought Alone. Margot Robbie arrived at her grandmother's house in the small coastal town carrying a single battered suitcase and a diagnosis that felt like a death sentence she had no idea how to appeal, and the elderly woman who opened the weathered door took one searching look at her granddaughter's devastated face and knew immediately that everything had gone catastrophically wrong. The house smelled like childhood memories Margot had almost forgotten, salt air and lavender sachets and the particular kind of warmth that only a grandmother's home can hold. But even that familiar comfort could not ease the terror of what lay ahead in the coming months. She told her grandmother everything that night, the words spilling out in jagged, broken pieces as she described Mitchell's surgical cruelty and the illness that had been advancing silently while she tried so desperately to build a life with a man who found her fundamentally inadequate. Her grandmother held her through the telling without offering empty platitudes or false reassurance. And when Margot finally admitted she was more afraid of facing this battle completely alone than she was of the battle itself, the old woman pulled back and looked at her with fierce protective love. She told Margot that she had already survived worse than Mitchell Holmes' cruelty and would survive worse than this diagnosis, that the particular strength required to walk away from someone who diminished your worth was exactly the same strength that would carry her through the treatments ahead. Treatment began the following week at a medical center 40 minutes away, and nothing the doctors had said in their careful clinical explanations prepared Margot for the brutal reality of what her body would endure over the months that followed. The procedures were designed to systematically kill the rapidly dividing cells that were trying to destroy her from within, but the treatments made absolutely no distinction between the illness and everything else. And Margot felt herself being dismantled at the cellular level while doctors monitored numbers and adjusted dosages. The first infusion session took 6 hours while she sat in a reclining chair, surrounded by others fighting their own private battles, and she watched the poison drip slowly into her veins through the port they had installed in her chest while trying desperately not to think about what it was doing to her body. The side effects began that same night with a vengeance that shocked her. nausea so intense she could not lift her head from the pillow without the room spinning violently, pain that radiated through her bones like nothing she had ever experienced or imagined possible. Exhaustion so complete and overwhelming that breathing felt like running a marathon through deep sand. Her grandmother sat faithfully beside her bed through those first terrible nights, offering water that Margot could not keep down for more than minutes and cool cloths for a fever that would not break despite medication. And Margot learned that survival was not a single heroic moment, but rather 10,000 small, agonizing decisions to keep breathing when breathing hurt and living felt impossible. The treatments continued with relentless regularity every other week, and Margot's entire world contracted to the narrow space between her grandmother's house and the medical center where she received the infusions that kept her alive while simultaneously making her wish for death. She lost weight with alarming speed until her clothes hung loose on a frame that no longer felt like her own body, and there were nights when the pain was so consuming and all-encompassing that she could not remember what it felt like to exist without it, could not recall the person she had been before illness redefined everything. Her hair began falling out in clumps that clogged the shower drain and covered her pillow each morning. And one day she stood in front of the bathroom mirror with scissors and shaved her own head before the treatment could take that final choice from her. Her grandmother found her sitting on the cold bathroom floor, surrounded by dark curls like a funeral, and instead of offering empty comfort about hair growing back eventually, the old woman simply sat beside her granddaughter and held her hand until the violent shaking finally stopped. They burned the hair in the fireplace that night, and Margot watched it turn to ash while thinking about transformation and survival and whether she would live long enough to see who she became on the other side of this nightmare, if there even was another side waiting. The doctors monitored her progress with cautious optimism, tempered by professional realism, adjusting treatment protocols when her body reacted poorly and celebrating small incremental victories when the tumor markers moved in the right direction, and Margot clung to those tiny improvements like a drowning person clings to driftwood in a storm. But there were significant setbacks that felt like free falling through darkness, infections that landed her in the hospital for days at a time, hooked to IV antibiotics, blood counts that dropped so dangerously low she could not leave the house for fear of what ordinary germs might do to her compromised immune system, moments when the cure felt infinitely more deadly than the disease it was supposedly treating. During the hardest months, when death felt closer than survival, Margot sometimes wished she had told Mitchell about the diagnosis, just so she would not feel so completely alone in this fight. But then she would remember his words about her inadequacy compared to Celestine and understand with perfect clarity that his presence would have made everything exponentially worse. She imagined him comparing her sick, weakened body to Celestine's perfect health, finding new creative ways she failed to measure up to his standards, and the fantasy of his support dissolved completely into the reality of who he had revealed himself to be when she needed him to be someone different. Halfway through her treatment, during a rare moment when she felt strong enough to sit outside between appointments, Margot met Holland Ashford in the hospital's carefully maintained garden. Holland was photographing the space for a project documenting medical resilience and the small moments of beauty that persisted even in places defined by suffering, and she approached Margot with gentle respect to ask if she would be willing to share her story for the series. Most people looked at Margot with pity that made her feel like she was already dying and just going through the motions. But Holland looked at her with immediate recognition, the kind that only comes from someone who has walked the exact same terrible path and somehow survived to tell about it. They talked for hours that first afternoon, sitting on a weathered bench surrounded by flowers that bloomed with complete indifference to human suffering, and Holland told Margot about her own battle with the same illness several years earlier. She did not offer irritating platitudes about staying positive or fighting hard, did not promise that everything would magically be fine, but simply acknowledged that this particular hell was unlike anything else, and that surviving it required a specific, brutal kind of courage that most people would never understand or need to summon. Holland showed Margot the faded scar on her chest where they had installed the port for her treatments, and that small gesture of shared experience meant infinitely more than any inspirational quote could ever accomplish. Margot found herself actively seeking out Holland's company during subsequent appointments over the following weeks, and their growing friendship became one of the few genuinely bright spots in the overwhelming darkness of treatment. Holland understood without requiring explanation why some days Margot could barely speak, why certain food smells made her violently ill, why she sometimes cried for no apparent reason except that her body had become a battlefield and she was exhausted from fighting a war she never chose. They talked about everything except the illness when Margot needed distraction, and discussed nothing but the illness when she needed someone who truly understood, and slowly Margot began to believe that survival might actually be possible rather than just a comforting lie doctors told to ease suffering. Chapter 4. Mitchell's Empire of Ashes. Mitchell. Holmes' marriage to Celestine became a masterclass in achieving everything society valued while feeling absolutely nothing genuine, and he watched his carefully constructed life unfold with the strange detachment of someone observing a stranger's mistakes through unbreakable glass that separated him from any possibility of intervention. They maintained elaborately separate residences within their shared properties, crossing paths only when social obligations absolutely demanded the flawless performance of marital unity for cameras and gossip columnists, and Mitchell learned to smile brilliantly for photographers while dying slowly inside at a pace so gradual he barely noticed the decay until the emptiness had consumed everything that once made him feel human. His business empire expanded with mechanical precision that impressed everyone who tracked such things, each successful acquisition adding meaningless zeros to accounts that represented nothing except his inability to build anything that mattered, and his partners commented privately that Mitchell had somehow lost the fire that once made him genuinely formidable in negotiations that required passion rather than just competence. The penthouse where he had destroyed Margot with his cruelty became completely unbearable to inhabit after Celestine moved out, every corner and surface holding vivid memories of what he had so carelessly sacrificed for nothing, and he sold it at a significant financial loss just to escape the constant visual reminders of the worst mistake he had ever made. He moved to a larger space with objectively better views and more expensive furnishings imported from Europe. But that new apartment felt exactly as empty as the old one because the fundamental problem was not the physical space, but rather the hollow person occupying it. He searched for Margot with an obsession that bordered on genuine madness during that entire first year, hiring multiple investigators who found absolutely nothing despite their considerable expertise and his essentially unlimited resources funding the search. They tracked down her former colleagues who claimed they barely knew her beyond superficial professional interactions, interviewed old neighbors who remembered her as quiet and intensely private, contacted distant family members who had not heard from her in years and seemed surprised anyone was asking. One particularly expensive investigator sat across from Mitchell after months of completely fruitless searching and delivered a disturbing theory that made Mitchell's stomach turn over with implications he could barely process without wanting to vomit. Given how completely and thoroughly Margot had disappeared, combined with her age and the specific timeline of her vanishing, the most statistically likely explanation was serious illness that she chose to face privately. The investigator explained with uncomfortable professional detachment that people who erased themselves that thoroughly and deliberately were usually either running from immediate danger or dealing with a catastrophic medical crisis they wanted to face completely away from the pity and invasive questions of their former lives. Young, healthy women did not simply vanish without any explanation unless something genuinely catastrophic had occurred, and the investigator's considerable experience suggested that Margot had either already died or was dying somewhere completely beyond Mitchell's considerable reach and resources. The words hung in the air between them like poison, and Mitchell felt bile rising in his throat as he processed the horrifying possibility that Margot might have been seriously sick when she left, might have desperately needed him at the exact moment he told her she was nothing compared to Celestine. The investigator asked with clinical curiosity if Margot had seemed unwell before she disappeared, if there had been any subtle signs Mitchell might have missed in his self-absorption, and Mitchell realized with dawning horror that he had been so focused on his own doubts about their relationship that he had not been paying any attention to what might have been happening in Margot's world beyond how it affected him. Mitchell spent the entire next week vomiting intermittently as his imagination conjured increasingly vivid scenarios that felt like punishment specifically designed for his particular sins by a cruel universe. He saw Margot, sick and alone, calling for him while he married Celestine in that historic estate, dying in some anonymous hospital while he celebrated his appropriate choice with expensive champagne, and the nightmares began shortly after and never really stopped coming. Vivid dreams, where he found Margot too late, where she looked at him with eyes that held no forgiveness, where his last words to her about her inadequacy were the final words she heard before dying completely alone. He would wake, gasping and sweating in beds that cost more than most people's cars, and feel the crushing physical weight of consequences that could not be undone or apologized away. His therapist suggested gently that he was projecting guilt onto an imagined worst-case scenario, that Margot had most likely simply moved on with her life and wanted nothing to do with him. But Mitchell could not shake the bone-deep certainty that something terrible had happened to her, and his cruelty had been the last thing she experienced from the man she had loved and trusted. The therapist tried repeatedly to help him process his guilt and move forward into some kind of functional future. But how do you move forward when you suspect you destroyed someone at the exact moment they needed saving most? Celestine filed for separation after enduring the marriage for exactly as long as the merger required to permanently stabilize her family's crumbling finances, and Mitchell did not fight it even slightly because their divorce only confirmed what he had known with perfect clarity since that wedding night. He had deliberately destroyed something irreplaceable for an obvious illusion, and now even the illusion was abandoning him with barely concealed relief at escaping their arrangement. She took her substantial settlement and moved permanently to Europe with the diplomat she had loved all along, and Mitchell signed the divorce papers with the numb efficiency of someone who no longer expected anything remotely good to happen in his life. Mitchell's empire grew steadily larger, while his actual life grew correspondingly emptier, and he found himself completely unable to form genuine connections with anyone because every interaction was filtered through the constant memory of what he had lost and could never recover. Women pursued him aggressively for his wealth and status and social connections, exactly the kind of pursuit he had once valued above authentic affection. And now it all felt completely hollow, because none of them looked at him the way Margot once had, with genuine affection and care, rather than calculated interest in what he could provide. His business partners invited him to exclusive social events he attended with dutiful consistency, and he made appropriate small talk while feeling absolutely nothing, seeing nothing, wanting nothing, except the impossible chance to go back to that night and choose differently. He played the role of successful eligible bachelor with the same hollow competence he had played the role of devoted husband, and people who met Mitchell home during this extended period would later say there was something distinctly cold about him, something that suggested he was only partially present in his own life. The years passed with relentless indifference to his suffering, and Mitchell realized he was building an empire with no one genuine to share it with, accumulating success that meant nothing because the only person he wanted to celebrate with had disappeared into a silence he could not penetrate. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Saw Her Completely. Holland Ashford entered Margot's life as a photographer, documenting stories of survival, and became something far more profound as their friendship deepened during the final grueling months of treatment and the uncertain, anxious period of recovery that followed. She lived in a modest cottage filled with her photography covering every available wall, images from her travels documenting stories of resilience and unexpected beauty in places most people overlooked or dismissed. And Margot found genuine peace in that cluttered creative space where artistic vision mattered infinitely more than social status or impressive credentials. Holland spoke about life and death and survival with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had faced her own mortality and chosen differently afterward, and she recognized in Margot the exact same strength she had needed to summon to rebuild her own existence after illness tried to destroy everything she was. She had lost her long-term partner years earlier to complications from the same disease, and that devastating loss had taught her that life was too precious to waste on people who could not see your value, that survival meant more than just continuing to breathe, but actually choosing to live with genuine intention and joy despite everything. But Holland was not some perfectly healed saint, dispensing wisdom from a place of complete peace and acceptance. She still struggled with survivor's guilt that woke her at 3 in the morning, still had panic attacks when friends got sick with anything serious, still sometimes woke from nightmares about the partner she had lost and the future they would never share together. Their friendship evolved slowly and organically during those final months of Margot's treatment, built on conversations that ranged from profound philosophical discussions to ridiculous arguments about television shows, depending on what Margot needed on any given day. Holland never treated her like she was fragile or dying, never offered the kind of toxic positivity that made Margot want to scream, but simply showed up consistently and let Margot be exactly who she was in each moment, without judgment. Some days that meant sitting in comfortable silence while Margot was too exhausted to speak, and other days it meant talking for hours about everything except the illness that was trying to kill her. Holland told stories about photographing remote communities who measured wealth in relationships rather than possessions, about learning to see beauty in unexpected places after loss, had trained her eyes differently, about the long, difficult years after her partner's death, when she had to completely relearn how to exist in a world that felt fundamentally changed and emptied of meaning. She admitted with surprising vulnerability that she had been genuinely terrified to care about anyone deeply again after losing someone to this illness. That meeting Margot had forced her to confront fears she thought she had already fully processed and moved past. Margot listened to these stories while slowly beginning to imagine a future where she too could rebuild something meaningful from the wreckage of what she had survived, where vulnerability was actually strength rather than weakness. When Margot's treatment finally ended and doctors declared her in remission with cautious optimism, Holland was there holding her hand through the appointment that felt more terrifying than any of the actual treatments had been, because now the possibility of recurrence would haunt every ache and unusual symptom. They celebrated that night on Margot's grandmother's weathered porch, drinking herbal tea because Margot's body still could not handle alcohol without immediate violent rejection, and watching the ocean reflect moonlight while talking about what came next in lives that had been on hold. Holland mentioned she was planning an extended photography trip to document coastal communities and asked if Margot might want to come along when she felt strong enough to travel, and something in Margot's chest loosened at the invitation. It was the first time since her diagnosis that anyone had invited her to think about a future beyond immediate survival and medical appointments, and she realized that Holland was offering her a chance to actually live again rather than just exist in the narrow space between doctor visits. Holland added quietly that she would completely understand if Margot needed space after treatment, that friendship formed in the crucible of shared trauma could be complicated and confusing, that she did not want to push for something Margot was not ready to give or receive. They spent the next several months slowly building something that felt like friendship, naturally evolving into something deeper and more intimate, though neither of them rushed to name it because both had learned that the best, most lasting things grew slowly rather than exploding into being. Holland taught Margot to see the world through a photographer's trained eye, pointing out light and shadow and moments of unexpected beauty that most people walked past without noticing, and Margot began sketching again for the first time since leaving Mitchell, her hands slowly remembering skills her mind had almost forgotten during the fight for survival. They took long walks on the beach where Margot was systematically rebuilding her strength and stamina, and Holland never commented on the days when Margot could only manage a few hundred difficult steps before exhaustion forced them to turn back. She simply adjusted her pace to match Margot's without drawing attention to the accommodation, and that small gesture meant infinitely more than any grand romantic gesture could have accomplished. One evening, as they watched the sunset from their favorite spot on the rocks, where waves crashed with hypnotic rhythm, Holland mentioned that her deceased partner would have genuinely liked Margot, that she had the same quiet strength and refusal to accept surface explanations for complex things, and Margot understood they had crossed some invisible threshold where the past and present were no longer separate territories, but had begun to merge into possibility. The first time Holland kissed her, they were standing in her cottage surrounded by photographs and dying golden light, and Margot had been helping her sort through images for an upcoming exhibition at a local gallery. Holland had been explaining the story behind a particular photograph when she stopped mid-sentence and looked at Margot with an expression that made Margot's breath catch in her throat. And then Holland was kissing her with gentle certainty, and Margot was kissing her back and crying because this felt nothing like the desperate intensity of her relationship with Mitchell. This felt steady and right and built on months of consistently showing up for each other through difficulty, and when they finally pulled apart, Holland wiped Margot's tears and asked if she was all right, her voice uncertain in a way that made her more human and real. Margot laughed through her crying and told her she was more than all right. She was happy, genuinely happy for the first time since the diagnosis that had tried to steal her future entirely. They stood there holding each other as the light faded completely to darkness, and Margot understood that surviving had led her here, to this woman who saw her completely and chose her anyway despite her own considerable fears and scars. Holland proposed months later on the same beach where they had taken those early difficult walks, and the ring she offered was simple silver with a small stone the color of sea glass, nothing like the ostentatious diamond Mitchell had never gotten around to offering her. Holland's hands shook slightly as she held the ring, and she admitted she was terrified of loving someone this deeply again after what she had lost, but that loving Margot made her braver than her fear. Chapter 6. The Daughter Who Made Them Whole. Margot and Holland decided to have a child together during a conversation that started casually and became profound, sitting in their favorite cafe drinking coffee while autumn rain turned the large windows into watercolor paintings that blurred the world outside. Holland mentioned that she had preserved eggs years earlier before beginning her own treatment, a choice made when she still believed her life with her partner would eventually include children, and Margot felt something shift in her chest at the possibility being offered. They talked for hours about what kind of parents they wanted to be, what values they wanted to instill, how they would handle the inevitable challenges that came with raising a child in a world that did not always understand or accept families like theirs. Everything was discussed and carefully considered rather than assumed, and when they finally decided they were ready to take this step together, both women wept with gratitude for the chance to create something beautiful from their survival. The process felt nothing like the vague fantasy Margot had once entertained about having Mitchell's children, where she had imagined herself fitting into his world rather than building a completely new world entirely. Margot became pregnant, using Holland's preserved eggs and a carefully chosen donor, and both women approached the pregnancy with the cautious hope of people who understand that absolutely nothing is guaranteed despite best efforts and intentions. The first trimester was difficult in unexpected ways, morning sickness combining with Margot's lingering anxiety about her health and body's ability to sustain life, and there were days when she was convinced her body would betray her again after having survived so much already. Holland was patient through every moment of fear and doubt, accompanying Margot to every single appointment and holding her hand through ultrasounds that confirmed everything was progressing normally, despite Margot's fears. They told Margot's grandmother together over tea one afternoon, and the elderly woman wept with joy while pulling them both into an embrace that felt like benediction. She told them their child would be blessed beyond measure to have two mothers who chose each other and chose this life together, and Margot felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the night Mitchell destroyed her. As Margot's pregnancy progressed through trimesters, they prepared the small room in their house that would become a nursery, painting walls in soft colors that felt peaceful and assembling furniture while talking about the future with tentative excitement. Holland photographed Margot's changing body with the same artistry she brought to all her work, creating images that celebrated the miracle of what was happening rather than focusing on conventional beauty standards. Margot looked at those photographs and saw herself as Holland saw her, strong and radiant and capable of creating life after surviving something that tried to kill her, and she understood that perspective was everything. Mitchell had looked at her and seen inadequacy that needed to be compared and found wanting, but Holland looked at her and saw perfection that needed no comparison. They attended birthing classes together and laughed at the absurdity of some of the exercises, bought tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small for an actual human, and chose the name Bree after Holland's grandmother, who had raised her after her own parents died in an accident. Bree was born on a spring morning after 14 hours of labor that tested every single ounce of Margot's hard-won strength, and when the doctor placed that tiny, perfect daughter in her arms, Margot understood why she had survived everything that tried to destroy her. Holland stood beside the hospital bed with tears streaming down her face, and when Margot passed their daughter to her, Holland held Bree with the reverent gentleness of someone cradling a miracle while also looking terrified that she might somehow break this precious, fragile thing. Margot's grandmother arrived within the hour, and the four of them formed a tableau of chosen family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with love and intentional choice. Bree had Margot's deep brown skin and eyes that seemed impossibly wise for a newborn, and from the moment she could focus her vision, she looked at both her mothers with equal devotion and trust. The early months of Bree's life were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, as all new parenthood is, and Margot and Holland navigated the challenges with the same intentional partnership they brought to everything else in their relationship. They took turns with middle-of-the-night feedings that left them bleary-eyed, celebrated small milestones with disproportionate joy that made perfect sense to them, and slowly found their rhythm as a family of three. Margot's grandmother became Nana, an irreplaceable presence who watched Bree while her mothers worked and told stories that connected their daughter to generations of survival and strength. Bree grew into a bright, curious toddler who asked impossible questions and gave love with the unguarded generosity of children who have never known rejection. She learned to walk by pulling herself up on Holland's photography equipment and taking hesitant steps between her mother's outstretched arms, and every milestone felt like evidence that beauty could emerge from survival. When Bree started forming complete sentences, her first clear phrase was, "two mamas," and both Holland and Margot cried at this simple acknowledgement of their family structure. Holland's photography career flourished as she documented their community with the same care she brought to everything, creating images that captured the essence of places and people, and Margot began teaching art at the local community center, discovering she had a natural gift for helping others find their creative voices. Their life together was simple in the ways that mattered and rich in the ways that actually counted, and Mitchell home existed only as distant scar tissue, a reminder of who Margot had been before she learned what real love looked like. When Margot occasionally thought about him, usually when Bree laughed in a particular way or asked a question that required careful answering, she felt only gratitude that his cruelty had pushed her toward this life instead of trapping her in one where she would always be found wanting. Chapter 7. The moment his blood ran cold. Mitchell Home arrived in the coastal town on business he could have delegated to any subordinate, but chose to handle personally because empty hours in an unfamiliar place felt preferable to empty hours in his penthouse surrounded by expensive things that meant nothing. His company was acquiring a boutique hotel property that overlooked the ocean, and he walked through the small downtown area with his assistant discussing renovation plans and market projections, while part of his mind catalogued how different this place felt from the city where he had built his empire on efficiency and competition. The town moved with an unhurried rhythm that felt almost foreign to someone who had spent years measuring time in billable hours and quarterly reports, and the people who passed them on the sidewalk actually made eye contact and nodded greeting to complete strangers. His assistant was mid-sentence about projected occupancy rates and seasonal tourism patterns when Mitchell's entire world tilted on its axis because Margot Robbie was walking toward them on the opposite sidewalk, holding hands with a small child, and both of them were laughing at something only they understood. Mitchell felt his heart stop completely as his mind tried to process what he was seeing after years of searching and finding nothing. A little girl who appeared to be around 2 years old held Margot's hand, chattering animatedly about something that made them both laugh, and Mitchell's blood ran cold with implications. Margot looked different in ways that had nothing to do with her physical appearance, though she seemed healthier and more solid than the woman who had left his penthouse. What truly stopped Mitchell's breath was the expression on her face as she looked down at the child. She smiled with a joy so complete and unguarded it made Mitchell realize she had never smiled at him that way, not once during their entire relationship, and the toddler looked up at her mother with absolute trust and adoration. Mitchell's assistant continued talking about the hotel acquisition, completely oblivious to the fact that his employer was no longer listening to a single word, and Mitchell stood frozen on the sidewalk as Margot and the child entered a small cafe across the street. His mind performed calculations with desperate speed, trying to determine if the timeline made sense, if this child could possibly be his daughter, hidden from him all these years. The little girl appeared to be around 2 based on her size and the way she moved, and Mitchell counted backward frantically while his blood ran cold with the possibility. He could not remember exactly how long it had been since Margot left. Time had blurred during the years of searching and failing to find her, collapsing into an undifferentiated mass of empty days, but the math seemed close enough to be plausible. This child could be his, conceived before their relationship ended, and Margot had hidden her from him all these years. The thought filled Mitchell with a complex mixture of rage and hope and desperate need to believe that some part of what he destroyed could still be salvaged. He told his assistant he would meet him back at the hotel later and crossed the street without conscious decision, his feet carrying him toward the cafe where Margot had disappeared inside. Through the large window, he could see them at a corner table, Margot helping the child into a chair and tucking a napkin around her small neck with practiced maternal efficiency, and Mitchell pushed through the door with his heart pounding so hard he could hear blood rushing in his ears. Margot looked up as the door chimed his entrance, and their eyes met across the room in a moment that felt suspended outside normal time. Mitchell watched every emotion cross her face in rapid succession: shock, recognition, fear, and then something that looked like bone-deep weariness, as though the last thing she wanted in this entire world was to see him standing there. She instinctively pulled the child closer, a protective gesture that made Mitchell certain this must be his daughter, and he approached their table with legs that felt unsteady beneath him. Up close, Margot was even more transformed than he had realized from across the street. Something fundamental had changed in her bearing, a confidence and peace that suggested she had found something he was still desperately seeking, and the little girl looked at him with curious eyes while Margot's face went carefully blank. Mitchell tried to speak and found his throat constricted with too many emotions to name, and when he finally managed words, they came out all wrong, demanding rather than gentle. Margot, just her name, but it sounded like an accusation rather than the greeting he had intended. She did not respond, simply looked at him with an expression that suggested she was waiting for him to finish whatever he had come to say so she could leave. The little girl continued eating the snack Margot had set in front of her, seemingly unconcerned by the tension crackling between the adults at her table. Mitchell tried again, his voice coming out too loud in the quiet cafe. "I've been looking for you, for years." Still wrong, still sounding like she owed him something rather than the apology he should be offering. Margot's expression did not change, and the silence stretched between them until Mitchell felt something snap inside his chest. "Who is this?" He gestured at the child, and several other patrons turned to look at the commotion. Margot flinched at the attention. "That's none of your concern, Mitchell." Her voice was quiet but firm, the kind of firm that suggested she would not be moved by anything he said. Mitchell leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of their table hard enough that his knuckles went white. "Is she mine? You can't just hide my daughter from me. I have rights." The words tumbled out in desperate succession, and Margot stood abruptly while lifting Bree into her arms in one smooth, protective motion. "She's not yours. My life after you is none of your concern. I need you to leave us alone right now." But Mitchell could not accept this, could not let go of the possibility that this child represented some chance at redemption for everything he had destroyed. "We need to talk. Somewhere private. You owe me that much after disappearing without a word for years." Margot's laugh was harsh enough to make Bree whimper against her shoulder, and Mitchell reached out to grab Margot's arm as she tried to walk past him toward the exit. The cafe had gone completely silent, and several men had stood up from their tables with expressions that suggested Mitchell was about to have a serious problem if he did not release her immediately. But before anyone could intervene, the door opened and a woman entered, carrying shopping bags and wearing an expression of confusion that rapidly shifted to protective concern when she saw the scene unfolding. Chapter 8. The Truth That Destroys Him. Holland dropped her shopping bags without seeming to notice them hit the floor, her entire focus immediately on Margot and the child in her arms, and she moved to her partner's side with the kind of protective instinct that suggested this was not a new dynamic, but something long established and practiced. "Is there a problem here?" Holland's voice was calm, but carried an edge that suggested she was holding back considerable anger while assessing whether this situation required immediate intervention. Mitchell released Margot's arm and stepped back, suddenly aware of how many people were watching this confrontation with undisguised hostility. "I just want to talk to Margot. We have unfinished business to discuss." Holland looked at him with an expression that combined contempt with something that might have been pity for how pathetic he appeared. "Margot doesn't owe you conversation or explanations. Bree is our daughter, not yours, and your presence is clearly upsetting them. You need to leave immediately." Mitchell stared at the woman who had just claimed joint parenthood of the child he had convinced himself must be his, and something broke inside him as he realized the complete picture of what he was seeing. "Your daughter." The words came out strangled, barely audible. Holland wrapped her arm around Margot's waist in a gesture so naturally protective it made clear this was not a new relationship, but something solid and established. "This is Holland, my fiancée, Bree's other mother. We built this life together, and you're not part of it in any way." Mitchell wanted to argue, wanted to insist they must have things to discuss after years apart. But Holland was already guiding Margot toward the door, while other cafe patrons watched with expressions of clear support for them and disgust toward him. "Wait, please!" The desperation in Mitchell's voice stopped them at the door. "The investigator I hired said you might have been sick when you disappeared. I've been terrified for years that something happened to you, that you might have—" He could not finish the sentence, could not voice the fear that had haunted him through countless sleepless nights. Margot turned slowly, and the expression on her face made Mitchell's stomach drop like he was falling from a great height. She looked at Holland, who nodded slightly, as though giving permission for something they had discussed before, and then Margot made a decision that would change everything Mitchell thought he understood about the past and his role in it. The investigator was right. I was sick. Her voice was steady despite the weight of what she was revealing, and Mitchell felt the floor drop away beneath him. I got the diagnosis 3 days before you told me I was nothing compared to Celestine. The cafe was so quiet, Mitchell could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. I was planning to tell you that night. Over the dinner I spent all day preparing. I had the medical papers in my purse. Mitchell tried to speak, but no words would come. I needed you to stand beside me through treatment. Instead, you showed me exactly what kind of support I could expect if I asked you for help. Several women in the cafe were openly crying now, and Mitchell felt bile rising in his throat as he understood what he had done. 9 months of treatment. Procedures that almost killed me multiple times. And you know what? I was grateful you weren't there. Margot's voice was stronger now, anger giving her power. Grateful I didn't have to survive both the illness and your inability to see my value. Grateful I didn't have you measuring my suffering against some standard of adequacy while I was fighting for my life. Holland's arm tightened around Margot's waist, and she looked at Mitchell with undisguised disgust. You've done enough damage to last several lifetimes. Leave them alone. Mitchell tried one more time to apologize, the words spilling out in desperate succession about how if he had known everything would have been different, how he would have stood by her, how his comparison had nothing to do with her actual worth, but rather his own fears and inadequacy. But Margot was already shaking her head. You needed me to be dying before you could see my value. That's exactly why you never deserved me in the first place. The words hit Mitchell like physical blows. Real love doesn't require tragedy to recognize worth. Real love sees it every day in ordinary moments. She adjusted Bree in her arms, and the child had stopped whimpering and was watching the adults with wide eyes. I hope you find peace eventually, Mitchell. I genuinely do. but my peace requires you staying out of my life completely. You need to understand that you don't exist in my thoughts anymore. You're just a cautionary tale I tell myself about what happens when you try to fit into someone else's idea of enough, instead of finding someone who sees you as already complete." Holland opened the door, and they walked out together into afternoon sunlight, leaving Mitchell standing among strangers who looked at him with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. He stumbled out of the cafe moments later and stood on the sidewalk where the afternoon sun felt too bright and the ocean air tasted like salt and profound regret. A woman who had been sitting near their table followed him out and spoke quietly. "You should be ashamed of yourself. That woman is a treasure in this community. She teaches my daughter art and never charges full price because she knows we struggle financially. She volunteers at the hospice center because she understands what it's like to face death. And you made her feel like she wasn't enough? You're the one who isn't enough, and you clearly still don't understand that." She walked away before Mitchell could respond, and he stood there understanding that there was no apology big enough, no explanation sufficient, no redemption possible for destroying someone during the exact moment they needed you most. Chapter 9. The Grandmother's Reckoning. Mitchell spent 3 days locked in his hotel room after that confrontation, unable to complete any of the business he had come to conduct, as the knowledge of what Margot had endured crushed him with physical weight that made movement difficult. He could not eat without his stomach revolting within minutes, could not sleep without nightmares showing him variations of Margot's suffering while he celebrated his wedding, could not function beyond the absolute basic requirements of continuing to breathe. Room service trays accumulated outside his door, and his assistant left increasingly concerned messages asking when he would be ready to finalize the acquisition. But even as Mitchell told himself he needed to leave this town immediately and never return, he knew he could not go without understanding the complete truth of what had happened during those years Margot was gone, what she had endured while he was building his empire and destroying his marriage. He researched obsessively using his laptop, learning that Margot was genuinely beloved in this community, that she and Holland were getting married soon at the lighthouse that overlooked the ocean. The hotel clerk mentioned it casually when Mitchell asked about local venues, and something in Mitchell broke completely at this news that she was promising forever to someone else. He convinced himself he needed to see Margot's grandmother, that the elderly woman might help him understand what Margot had endured so he could properly process his guilt and maybe find some path forward. He found the address through public records and drove to the house on a grey morning that matched his internal landscape. And when he knocked on the weathered door, the woman who answered took one long look at him and knew exactly who he was without requiring introduction. Margot's grandmother stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her with a firmness that suggested he was absolutely not welcome in her home. "Say what you came to say quickly. I don't want you anywhere near my great-granddaughter when she wakes from her nap." Mitchell's carefully prepared speech dissolved completely under the weight of her gaze. "I need to understand what happened. Margot told me she was sick, but I don't know the details. I've been living with guilt ever since, and knowing she was dying while I—" He could not finish the sentence. The grandmother looked at him with an expression that combined pity and contempt in equal measure. "You want me to help you feel better about what you did? To give you details that will somehow make your guilt more manageable so you can move on with your life?" "I need to know," Mitchell whispered. "I need to understand the complete picture of what I destroyed." The grandmother was silent for a long moment, studying him with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "You want the complete picture? Fine. Let me paint it for you." Her voice shook with controlled rage. "She arrived here already sick, heartbroken. The diagnosis had come just days before, and you had destroyed her the very night she planned to ask for your support. Mitchell had heard this part already in the cafe, but the grandmother was not finished, and her details were different, more specific, more devastating. Do you want to know what the first month of treatment was like? She couldn't keep down food for 3 weeks straight. Lost 20 pounds from an already small frame. I held a bucket beside her bed for hours while she vomited until there was nothing left. Then she'd vomit bile, then blood. The doctors said that was normal. Can you imagine hearing that your granddaughter vomiting blood is considered normal? Mitchell felt tears streaming down his face, but the grandmother showed absolutely no mercy. There was a night in the 3rd month when her fever spiked so dangerously high, the hospital genuinely thought she might not make it through until morning. They packed her in ice while machines beeped urgent warnings. I sat beside that bed holding her hand and praying to a God I wasn't sure existed anymore, and I made bargains I knew I couldn't keep if she would just survive. And you know what she said when the fever finally broke just before dawn? The grandmother's voice cracked with emotion. She said, "At least Mitchell isn't here to see how ugly I am like this." Even half dead with fever, she was grateful you weren't there to make her feel worse about herself. Mitchell made a sound that might have been a sob, but the grandmother continued relentlessly. The hair loss devastated her in ways the physical pain never did. Not because she cared about her appearance in some vain way, but because it made the illness visible to everyone, made it real and undeniable. She shaved her own head one morning before I woke up, and when I found her sitting on the bathroom floor surrounded by dark curls, she told me she needed to take that choice before the treatment took it from her entirely. We burned that hair in the fireplace, and I watched my granddaughter's face in the flames and wondered if you ever thought about what you'd done to her. The grandmother described daily indignities Mitchell had never considered. The port in Margot's chest that sometimes got infected and required emergency room visits in the middle of the night when her fever spiked. The mouth sores that made speaking painful, but that Margot powered through because silence made her feel more like a victim than a fighter. The blood transfusions when her counts dropped dangerously low. The bone pain that made her cry out in her sleep even when she was unconscious. The steroids that made her face swell until she barely recognized herself in mirrors. The grandmother's voice was raw with old pain. She had to wear masks everywhere during treatment because her immune system couldn't fight off basic germs. Do you know what it's like watching your granddaughter afraid to hug you because you might accidentally kill her with common cold bacteria? There were days she was so weak she couldn't walk to the bathroom alone. I helped her bathe, helped her dress, held her when she cried from the humiliation of needing help with basic functions at 28 years old. But she was also so incredibly strong, the grandmother continued, her voice shifting slightly. Some days when she felt marginally better, she would sit on the porch and sketch with hands that shook from exhaustion because creating something beautiful helped her remember she was more than this illness consuming her. She volunteered to talk to other patients going through treatment, offering hope when she barely had any herself. She never gave up, even on days when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing to fight. Mitchell tried to speak, tried to explain that if he had known about the diagnosis, he would never have said those terrible, cruel things, but the grandmother cut him off. "That's what makes it worse, don't you see? You didn't need her to be dying to be kind to her. You should have been kind anyway, valued her anyway, seen her worth anyway. The fact that learning about her illness makes you regret your cruelty proves you valued her life more than her feelings, her survival more than her dignity." The grandmother told him about Holland then, about how she had been there through the absolute worst of it, showing up with groceries when Margot was too weak to shop, sitting in silence when conversation was too exhausting, celebrating small victories like keeping down a meal or walking once around the block. Holland loved Margot when she was at her weakest and most vulnerable, didn't need her to be impressive or healthy or anything other than exactly who she was in that moment. That's what real love actually looks like, not whatever you thought you were offering her. The grandmother's next words were delivered with devastating clarity that would haunt Mitchell forever. Margot hasn't thought about you in months before you showed up and forced yourself back into her awareness. You exist for her as scar tissue and cautionary tale. That's your real punishment, complete irrelevance. You don't haunt her dreams or occupy her thoughts anymore. You're just the mistake she survived on her way to finding real happiness with someone who deserves her. Chapter 10. The Lighthouse Where She Chose Forever. The wedding took place on an autumn afternoon, when the sky competed with the ocean for which could be more brilliantly blue, and the lighthouse stood as silent witness to a ceremony that had everything to do with two women choosing each other from a place of strength, and nothing to do with obligation or societal expectation. 40 guests gathered on the lawn that sloped gently toward the rocks where waves crashed with their eternal rhythmic persistence, and every single person present genuinely loved Margot and Holland, rather than attending for social currency or business networking opportunities. Margot's grandmother sat in the front row wearing her best dress and holding a tissue she had already soaked completely through with happy tears, and Bree danced in circles wearing the flower crown she had insisted on wearing since dawn, despite her mother's gentle suggestions that she might want to wait until the ceremony actually started. The gathering buzzed with warm conversation and genuine affection, people who had watched this family grow and wanted to celebrate their commitment to each other. When the processional music began, both brides emerged from the lighthouse together because neither of them believed in being given away like property changing hands in some transaction. Margot wore a dress the color of sea foam that Holland had helped her choose during an afternoon of trying on options and laughing at the ridiculous formality of traditional wedding gowns designed for completely different kinds of ceremonies, and wildflowers were woven through the hair that had grown back curlier and shot through with silver after treatment. Holland wore a simple suit the color of beach sand and carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers, and when they saw each other in that doorway, both women stopped walking to simply look at each other with expressions that made several guests openly weep. They had agreed to walk together toward their future rather than being escorted separately, and they moved in perfect synchrony down the aisle that was just a path worn through grass by countless footsteps, while Bree ran ahead scattering flower petals with more enthusiasm than precision. The officiant spoke briefly about the journey that had brought them to this moment, about how both women had faced profound darkness and actively chosen light, about how their love was built on the solid foundation of showing up for each other through uncertainty and joy alike. Then she invited them to share the vows they had written, and Margot spoke first with a voice that only trembled slightly despite the weight of what she was saying. "Holland, I promise to love you through every season of our shared life, through the ordinary moments that make up our days and the extraordinary ones that take our breath away, through the times when everything makes perfect sense and the times when we have to figure things out together as we go." Margot's voice grew stronger and more confident as she continued speaking her truth. "I promise to choose you every single day, the way you chose me when I was broken and scared and didn't believe I deserved to be chosen by anyone. I promise to build a life where our daughter grows up knowing that love is action rather than pretty words, that family is built on conscious intention rather than biological obligation." Margot looked at Holland with such complete adoration that several guests had to look away from the intimacy of that gaze. "I promise that our home will always be a place where all of us can be exactly who we are, without fear of being found inadequate or compared to anyone else. I promise to celebrate your strength and hold space for your vulnerabilities, because you've taught me that real partnership means seeing each other completely, shadows and light together. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like after I had almost forgotten it was possible. Thank you for standing beside me through the hardest battle of my life when you could have walked away. Thank you for choosing to build this family with me. I am grateful every morning that I survived long enough to find you, to love you, to create this beautiful life with you. Holland's vows were quieter, but no less profound, as she promised to see Margot completely, to celebrate her strength and hold her through her vulnerabilities, to be the partner she genuinely deserved rather than the partner who made her question her fundamental worth. Margot, I promise that Bree will always know she has two mothers who love her without conditions, who will show up for her the way we show up for each other every single day. I promise that our family will be built on conscious intention rather than assumption, on daily choices rather than empty obligation that creates resentment. Holland spoke about the first time she met Margot in that hospital garden and knew immediately she was seeing someone who possessed the kind of profound courage most people would never understand or need to summon. Watching you fight for survival taught me that love is about bearing witness to someone's truth, rather than trying to shape them into a more convenient version that fits our expectations. I promise that our marriage will be a daily choice rather than an obligation we endure. I promise I will never take you for granted or compare you to anyone, because you are incomparable and perfect exactly as you are. I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of the trust you place in me, the life you've chosen to build with me, the love you give so generously. When Holland finished speaking, Margot was crying openly, and Bree climbed up onto the platform to hug both her mothers, while the guests applauded through their own tears and someone whistled appreciatively from the back. The exchange of rings was simple and profound. Two circles of silver that represented infinity and intentional commitment, and when the officiant pronounced them married, Holland and Margot kissed with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you have chosen exactly right. The reception that followed was casual and warm, tables laden with food prepared by friends and neighbors who wanted to contribute, music played by local musicians who donated their considerable talent because they loved this family, and dancing that continued as the sun set and the lighthouse beacon began its nightly rotation. Margot danced with her grandmother while the old woman told her how proud she was and how grateful that Margot had survived long enough to find this happiness, and Holland danced with Bree while their daughter laughed with the pure delight of a child who knew she was loved without conditions. The community celebrated with genuine enthusiasm rather than polite obligation, and Margot understood that this gathering was everything her relationship with Mitchell had not been: real rather than performed, chosen rather than obligated, built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. Far below the lighthouse where the ceremony had taken place, Mitchell Holmes stood on the rocks watching from a distance where he could see clearly but not be seen by the celebrating guests. He had not left town as planned, but instead remained in his hotel room, torturing himself with the knowledge of what was happening today. And he had finally driven to the lighthouse, unable to stay away, despite knowing his presence was completely unwelcome. He watched Margot laughing in Holland's arms, watched Bree dancing between her mothers with pure joy, watched a community celebrating a union that had nothing to do with status or pedigree and everything to do with two people who had earned their happiness through survival and conscious choice. He saw Margot's grandmother wiping happy tears while surrounded by friends who clearly adored her family, and he understood that this story had no room for him, had never had room for him once he made the choices that defined who he was fundamentally. There would be no dramatic interruption where he declared his love, no last-minute confession that changed anything, no redemption arc waiting for men who destroyed real love in pursuit of shallow validation from people who did not actually care. Mitchell remained on those rocks until the reception ended and guests began departing with warm farewells, until he watched Margot and Holland and Bree walk hand in hand toward their car surrounded by well-wishers, until the lighthouse stood alone against the darkening sky with only its beacon continuing its patient rotation. Then he returned to his hotel and packed his belongings with mechanical precision, and the next morning he flew back to his empty penthouse and his successful career and his loveless existence that stretched before him like a prison sentence. The rest of Mitchell Holmes' life would be spent knowing that the greatest thing he ever had, he destroyed with his own hands during the exact moment she needed him most, and that knowledge was a punishment specifically designed for his particular sins. He would build his empire larger, accumulate more meaningless wealth, achieve every metric of success his world valued, and absolutely none of it would matter, because the only person he wanted to celebrate with had moved so completely past him that his existence was irrelevant to her happiness. Margot did not think of Mitchell during her wedding day or the honeymoon that followed, because she had learned that true survival meant letting go of people who could not see your value, and she had found her forever in Holland's steady devotion and Bree's unconditional love, and a life that proved love was about showing up rather than grand gestures that cost nothing real.